The Marvel Cinematic Universe is currently in the midst of experiencing potentially its most important year yet, but another comic book movie franchise has been experiencing changes of its own too: the DC Extended Universe. Back when it was conceived in 2013, the DCEU was set to be Warner Bros.' answer to the MCU. Zack Snyder, albeit a divisive filmmaker, had a proven box office draw, and what better way to mount that challenge, they thought, than with Superman. The story since has been anything but smooth sailing, with Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, Suicide Squad, and Justice League all floundering amongst critics, while the latter failed to make any waves financially either. Couple that with a future slate of films that failed to really inspire any kind of confidence amongst audiences, and it's clear that, until recently, the DCEU was in dire straits. Now, with a markedly different set of upcoming projects, a new Batman and a new direction, WB might finally be able to mount the challenge they hoped Man of Steel would in 2013. But what comics should they use to make it happen? As always, I'm Ewan, and here are 10 comics the DCEU must adapt to beat Marvel. Number 10, Batman and the Monster Men. There are a whole host of Bat books that should inform Matt Reeves' upcoming interpretation of The Dark Knight, but none more so than Matt Wagner and Dave Stewart's Batman and the Monster Men. Until recently, it was rumored that Reeves' Batman film would take place early on in the Caped Crusader's career, which contrasted heavily with Zack Snyder's Dark Knight Returns-inspired interpretation of the Vigilante. Such a move would have necessitated Ben Affleck's exit from the role, and lo and behold, the other month, that very thing happened. In the wake of Affleck's decision to leave the part behind, the actors seemed to confirm those earlier rumors that Reeves' film would show Batman towards the beginning of his crime-fighting career. If this is the case, then Reeves should look no further than Wagner and Stewart's story. It depicts Batman just after the events of Year 1, but with the added wrinkle of him encountering his first ever supervillains. Number 9, Suicide Squad, From the Ashes. Dubbed simply the Suicide Squad, this new iteration of the team will supposedly leave behind most of the film's cast in favor of a brand new lineup. Will Smith is out as Deadshot, Idris Elba is in, and while it's still unconfirmed as to whether or not Margot Robbie's Harley Quinn will appear, given the renewed focus on the character, one would expect her to feature in one way or another. The main problem with the first film was that it really didn't justify the squad's creation. Pretty much any super team could go ahead and deal with a public world-ending sky portal, whereas the squad are usually deployed to handle much more covert and sensitive matters. How better to go back to basics then than with the original creator's book? Number 8, Deathstroke, The Professional. Deathstroke's status in the rapidly changing DCEU is somewhat confusing. At first, it was announced that Joe Manganiello would play the character in Ben Affleck's solo Batman movie, but with Batfleck out and Reeves in, it's still unclear as to whether or not he may appear. However, irrespective of whether or not there is a future for Slade Wilson in the DCEU, WB would do well to take inspiration from the character's most recent comics. They are sublime and have been orchestrated by renowned comic book writer Christopher Priest, and even involved the legendary Larry Hama on the first volume's layouts. Put simply, Priest's Deathstroke is genius. The character may not be the first one you associate with genuinely clever storytelling, but its rebirth years have been nothing short of spectacular, imbuing the villain with a hefty dose of espionage fiction, politics, and even some feuding with the Dark Knight himself. Number 7, Cosmic Odyssey. If you were looking for the comic that is pretty much DC's Infinity War, look no further than Cosmic Odyssey. A 1988 series written by Jim Starlin and drawn by Hellboy creator Mike Mignola, Cosmic Odyssey is a treat. It is Starlin's name, however, that'll make those Infinity War comparisons immediately apparent, as the writer also helmed the saga that's currently inspiring the MCU's cosmic-based Avengers films. Just like Infinity Gauntlet, Cosmic Odyssey brings together some of the biggest names in the DC universe to tackle a whole new threat, with the new gods Batman, Superman, and Green Lantern just some of the names involved. With that in mind, if WB look to bring the Justice League back together in the future, this is the comic they should look to. Number 6. Aquaman by Peter David. James Wan's Aquaman film may have worked fine enough by taking the bulk of its story from Jeff Johns' stint on the character during the New 52, but there's plenty of other material to look to that predates the writer's run. Although it's only recently that King Arthur Curry has found mainstream recognition, the character hasn't been a joke in the comics for over 3 decades. One of the writers who was instrumental in tackling that stigma was Peter David, who gave Aquaman a whole new makeover from 1994 onwards. Visually, audiences can probably already see comparisons between the writer's version of the character and the one portrayed on screen by Jason Momoa, but there's another element that's completely missing: the hook hand. Right, look, okay, so the hook hand is great. I will hear nothing that says opposite. See, the 90s weren't all that bad after all. Number 5. Batgirl Year 1. Barbara Gordon may not feature in the upcoming Birds of Prey, but she's bound to play a part in the DCEU at some point or another. A Batgirl film featuring Babs was announced a few years ago with Joss Whedon originally at the helm. However, Whedon soon exited the project and a new writer was brought on board, Christina Hodson, who penned Bumblebee for Paramount, as well as the script for Kathy Yan's aforementioned film. Given the last time audiences saw Barbara Gordon on screen came in 1997's Batman and Robin though, it's perhaps inevitable that the upcoming film will be an origin story. Fortunately for readers and for Hodson, there have been loads of brilliant stories that have chronicled Gordon's burgeoning years as a crime fighter, including the aptly titled Batgirl Year 1. Number 4. Mr. Miracle, 2017. Of all the upcoming DC projects, it is Ava DuVernay's New Gods that should get fans most excited. After all, DuVernay is a superb director, and she now gets to work her magic on some of the most inspirational and creative stories that DC has ever published: Jack Kirby's Fourth World Saga. At the core to this series was the conflict between the planets of New Genesis and Apocalypse, the former ruled by the ostensibly benevolent Highfather, and the latter by the indisputably tyrannical Darkseid. In order to achieve a truce between Apocalypse and New Genesis, the two leaders decide to swap their children, because obviously. Darkseid's boy becomes Orion, while Highfather's son, Mr. Miracle, heads to Apocalypse, where he's then tortured for the rest of his days at Granny Goodness's orphanage. Eventually, he falls in love with Big Barda and escapes to Earth, which is where Tom King and Mitch Gerads' series comes in. It's haunting, honest, and though not nearly half as epic enough to inspire an entire film, it embodies the relationship between Scott and Barda perfectly. Number 3. The Sinestro Core War. Green Lantern, despite what the 2010 Ryan Reynolds fronted film would tell you, has the potential to be DC Star Wars. The IP possesses so much in terms of mythology that it could easily make for an entire saga of its own. Among the DC films currently hinted to release in the future is Green Lantern Corps, which, according to rumors, will also focus on Hal Jordan and Jon Stewart. The latter is a fan favorite character, having featured heavily across various DC media in the early 2000s, and the buddy cop potential in pairing him with Jordan is fairly evident. The Sinestro Core War may not necessarily be a Hal and Jon story, but it's the kind of one that should form the basis for WB's Green Lantern reboot. Number 2. Supergirl, being super. Henry Cavill's exit from the DCEU might have been hailed as something of a worst-case scenario by the series' most ardent fans, but in truth, it was time for DC to try something different. It's still unclear as to whether or not Superman will ever reappear again, but we know for a fact that WB will now be focusing on Supergirl instead. Kara Zor-El is the Man of Steel's cousin in the comics, and has featured in some truly wonderful stories over the years. Again, however, her upcoming movie might best be served by looking to the character's most recent adventures. Sure, there are plenty of brilliant older runs to her name, but the recent Supergirl Being Super provides the perfect blueprint for a Supergirl origin movie to work off. Being Super focuses on Kara as a teenager, adjusting to the challenges of high school, all while discovering her own powers. It's easy to see how it could work on the big screen, and if Supergirl is set to play as big a role as has been rumoured, you won't find a better place to start than there. And number 1, Justice League New World Order. Justice League New World Order might not be the most blockbuster League tale going, but it did bring the group back in a uniquely brilliant way. It also featured a definitive lineup, but with the League ostensibly on hiatus, that future could be a long way off. In any case, New World Order presents the perfect template to bring a whole new version of the League into being. It doesn't matter if there's no Superman, Flash, or Cyborg, but what is paramount is that it gets to the core of what makes the Justice League so darn fascinating. They aren't just another group of super friends with ridiculous powers, but a team with a proper legacy. That never really shone through in Joss Whedon's film. But with this kind of story informing a potential revival, WB could make the world fall in love with the team on the second go.